At 5:14 local time, the water ahead of the destroyer no longer looked like open sea. On the bridge, no one said the word minefield out loud. They didn't need to. Less than a mile from the bow, in the grey half-light before sunrise, dark shapes were moving with the swell. They were too low to be boats, too evenly spaced to be random debris, and too carefully placed to ignore. The destroyer had been passing through the Strait of Hormuz under routine transit conditions. Steady course, controlled speed, every watch station doing exactly what it had been trained to do. By Gulf standards, the sea was calm. Visibility was good enough. Nothing on the surface picture pointed to an immediate problem. Then the forward lookout reported in. Bridge, possible floating objects, bearing 086. Multiple contacts low in the water. There was no shouting, no confusion, just an instant change in the air. Inside the Combat Information Center, operators leaned closer to their screens. Surface search updated. Electro-optical and infrared feeds were brought forward. Navigation overlays tightened. The officer of the deck looked through the bridge glass toward the dim water ahead, then back to the repeater display. The captain stepped closer. His face did not change. "Reduce speed," he said. "Hold course. Verify." That was the first sign this was not a normal contact report. A destroyer captain does not slow down in the Strait of Hormuz without a reason. Speed gives options. Momentum gives control. Letting go of either means something ahead has changed the situation. The ship's wake shortened. Engine noise dropped slightly. On the bridge, every set of eyes stayed forward. Then the camera found the objects. Round, dark, sitting low. Almost invisible until the swell lifted them into view for a second at a time. One appeared, then another, farther off the port side. They were not drifting by chance. They formed a pattern. Not random spacing, but geometry. In CIC, the tactical action officer compared the positions against known deployment patterns. The result was not reassuring. "These are not buoys," he said. No one answered. No one had to. The destroyer was no longer looking at open water. It was looking at a decision point. Seconds later, another layer appeared. Two small Iranian boats showed up at the edge of the surface picture. They were still distant. They were not rushing in. They were not making a dramatic move. They were simply there, offset and watching, positioned exactly where they could be seen, yet far enough away to remain difficult to read. That made it worse. One floating object could be debris, two could be junk, but a line of them ahead of a U.S. destroyer with Iranian craft waiting nearby was something very different. Then the radio came alive. "U.S. warship! Alter course immediately. Unsafe waters ahead." The voice was clear, calm, and in English. No confusion, no urgency, no attempt to hide who was speaking. On the bridge, heads turned toward the handset, then back toward the water. The warning had come too late, and it had come too cleanly. That mattered. Real maritime safety calls are rarely perfect. They usually come early, they repeat. They sound strained, rushed, or uncertain. This one arrived at the exact moment the destroyer had already identified the hazard for itself. Not before, not long after. Right on cue. The captain understood what that meant. Someone was not trying to protect the destroyer from what lay ahead. Someone was trying to shape where it went next. "Maintain present heading," he said. "No course changes until we have the full picture." That order revealed the real tension of the moment. The problem was no longer only the objects in the water ahead. The greater risk was being pushed into a sudden turn without knowing what might be waiting off either side. In the low light, another mine-like shape rolled into view. This one was closer than the first estimates had suggested. The navigator checked the depth. CIC updated the range. The bridge team recalculated the closure rate. Too close for comfort. Still far enough to get through if nobody guessed wrong. Behind the bridge windows, sunrise had not fully broken. The sea remained a sheet of dull steel, interrupted only by the slow rise of dark shapes that had no business being there. Each object seemed to send the same silent message. Keep moving without understanding the pattern, and the ship might not make it out. The Iranian boat stayed back. The radio went quiet. Inside the destroyer, the feeling was not panic. It was focus, pressed tight into every compartment and every console. Every station was locked onto the same reality. One wrong rudder command could hand control of the moment to someone else. An officer trained to read the electro-optical feed leaned closer to the screen and said what many on board were already thinking. "This doesn't look random," he said. "It looks placed." Placed, not scattered, not forgotten, not left behind by chance. What waited ahead of the destroyer was not simply a hazard in the water. It was a shaped problem. A corridor of pressure, a set of choices designed to make the ship react quickly, under stress, and possibly in the wrong direction. The captain stood motionless for another second, watching the dark contact line lift and disappear with the swell. At this point, the destroyer was no longer just passing through the Strait of Hormuz. It was being pushed toward a decision. By 5:16 local time, the ship was holding itself together inside a problem that looked built on purpose. Speed came down another notch. Not so much that the ship lost control, but enough to buy time. On the bridge, the helm answered in fractions, not dramatic turns. Below, inside the Combat Information Center, the picture grew sharper by the second. Surface search, electro-optical feed, navigation overlays, sonar, electronic warfare. All of it began folding into one hard truth. The dark objects ahead were only the first layer. "Bring the helo up," the captain said. The order moved through the ship immediately. A Seahawk helicopter had already been standing by. Now standby was over. On the flight deck, tie-down chains came off, rotor blades unlocked. Crew chiefs moved fast, controlled, and without wasted motion. This was exactly what the training was for, moments when the sea itself becomes part of the problem and nobody has time for drama. Above the destroyer, dawn began to spread low across the Gulf, turning the water the color of cold steel. As the MH-60R lifted clear and banked forward, the bridge crew watched it disappear into the gray. If the surface picture was incomplete, the air view might reveal the truth. If there was a safe path through the water ahead, the helicopter would see it first. Inside CIC, the electronic warfare operator raised a hand. New emissions from shore, intermittent surface search profile. No one needed to say whose coastline mattered now. It was close enough to affect the situation, yet distant enough to complicate every response. The destroyer was caught between the objects in the water and whatever might already be tracking from land. Then the radio came alive again. U.S. warship alter south immediately. Unsafe defensive waters ahead. The wording had changed. Not just unsafe waters now, defensive waters. That was not a simple safety call. That was pressure disguised as procedure. On the bridge, the captain listened without changing expression. "Log it," he said. Ahead of the ship, the Seahawk's infrared feed began sending clean imagery back to CIC. What had looked from sea level like a loose line of floating objects now appeared from above as something far more deliberate. The mine-like contacts were not drifting naturally. They formed a partial belt, curved just enough to shape movement. Not a wall, a funnel. Then the aircrew spotted the most important detail yet. There were gaps. 2 possible lanes, the sensor operator said. Repeat, 2 openings in the line. That should have felt like good news. It did not. One opening sat farther north, narrow and uneven, with several contacts positioned just outside it, like the edges of a trap. The other was farther south, wider, clearer, and almost too easy to see. The kind of route a pressured bridge team might choose if forced to turn in a hurry. The pilot circled again. The sensor operator tightened the image. The southern gap showed something else. A wake line. Faint, older, but visible. Someone had passed through there recently, or someone wanted it to look that way. Inside CIC, the mine warfare-trained watch officer leaned in. "That's too clean," he said. "Could be a deception lane." The atmosphere changed immediately. A field of dangerous objects was one problem. A field arranged to offer the wrong way out was something else entirely. The destroyer held its course, barely. Ahead, the dark shapes rose and fell with the swell, patient and silent. On the starboard edge of the surface picture, the 2 Iranian boats began moving again. Not fast, not aggressively, just enough to shift with the destroyer. They were not chasing, they were shepherding, and that word hung over the bridge. Now the logic was clear. The objects in the water did not need to block every possible route. They only needed to remove enough options to influence the rudder. The boats did not need to open fire. They only had to stay visible. The voice on the radio did not need to persuade anyone. It only had to add pressure to a decision that was already difficult. This was lane denial. Control through placement. Coercion by geometry. "Captain," the navigator said quietly, "recommend no hard turns south." He did not use the word trap. He did not have to. Another report came in from the helicopter. Possible moored object beyond the southern lane, bearing 094 from the ship, partially submerged, not consistent with random debris. That was the second hit to the picture. Even if the southern opening was real, something might be waiting just beyond it. A second hazard, a trigger point, a decoy designed to force one more correction after the ship committed. In other words, the exit might not be an exit at all. It might be the next stage. The captain answered in the same voice he had used from the beginning. Calm, level, unhurried. "If they want us turning fast," he said, "we turn slow. If they want us blind, we map everything." That became the ship's posture. On the bridge, the destroyer steadied. Above it, the helicopter kept circling. Inside CIC, every contact was marked, numbered, and fed into the tactical picture. No one was chasing certainty anymore. They were building it. Then one final image came back from the Seahawk, clear enough to end the debate. On one of the nearest dark objects, barely visible above the waterline, the camera caught a tether angle and a brief metallic flash beneath the swell. Anchored. Placed. Intentional. The destroyer was not being boxed in by the objects alone. It was being boxed in by the decisions those objects were meant to force. At 5:19 local time, the ship stopped trying to outrun the problem and started taking it apart. That shift changed everything. A nervous ship makes speed, a disciplined ship makes measurements. And in that moment, discipline was the only thing keeping the destroyer from giving the other side exactly the reaction it wanted. On the bridge, the captain gave an order that few people outside the Navy would ever recognize as a kind of counterattack. Maintain minimal headway, helm answers in single degrees only. No hard rudder. No sudden swing to port, no rushed brake to the south. The destroyer kept only enough motion through the water to hold steerage and nothing more. In restricted waters under pressure, too much movement becomes risk, too little becomes drift. What the crew needed now was control measured in inches, not yards. Inside the Combat Information Center, every station was locked onto the same picture. Surface contacts, mine-like objects, helicopter feed, shore emissions, navigation depth, current estimates. Nothing stood alone anymore. Every screen was now part of one question. Where could a U.S. destroyer move without giving the other side the exact response it wanted? Above them, the Seahawk circled again, careful and methodical. The aircraft stayed outside the immediate danger area while its sensors did the risky work. From altitude, the pattern below looked less like confusion and more like design. The northern lane was tighter than it first appeared, but its spacing was irregular in a way that mattered. It looked uncomfortable, messy, harder to present as a safe route. And that made it more believable. The southern gap was still too clean. That detail kept returning. A trap does not always hide itself. Sometimes it advertises the wrong answer. Recommend we disregard the southern lane, the Mine Warfare Watch officer said. It looks built to attract a fast correction. The captain nodded once. Agreed. Off the starboard side, one of the Iranian fast boats increased speed. Not enough to close in dangerously, just enough to shift ahead of the destroyer's beam. Its wake cut white across the grey water, then faded back into the swell. The second boat stayed farther back, offset like insurance. They were not attacking, they were shaping. That was the key difference. And everyone on the ship could feel it. These boats were not there to win a direct fight with an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. They were there to pull attention, influence movement, and turn seconds into pressure. In waters like these, pressure was a weapon by itself. The radio snapped alive again. U.S. warship, alter course south. You are now entering restricted defensive waters. The destroyer did not answer. That silence was not hesitation. It was refusal. The U.S. ship would not allow the voice on the radio to set the rhythm of the bridge. Instead, the navigator studied the depth contours. The conning officer checked the closing distance to the nearest anchored contact. The helmsman waited with both hands steady, ready for corrections so small they barely counted as turns. The lee helmsman managed engine output in careful increments. Somewhere below, the machinery hummed with restrained force. A warship was choosing patience over instinct. Then the helicopter crew found another problem. Bridge, helo! Bridge, helo. New contact in the water, bearing 089. Low profile, possibly semi-submerged, drifting slightly with the current. A new dark shape appeared on the feed, far enough ahead to matter and just offset enough to complicate the northern lane. It was not part of the first obvious belt, it was something else. Maybe a decoy, maybe a real device shifted by the tide, maybe exactly the kind of loose uncertainty meant to force a rushed correction at the worst possible moment. On the bridge, the tactical action officer said what everyone was already thinking. They don't need every contact to be real, they just need enough of them to own our rudder. That was the trap in its purest form. Not direct control, decision control. The destroyer edged forward another fraction. 1 degree right, hold. 5 seconds. 1 degree left, hold. Every correction was checked against the helicopter feed before it became movement. Every yard of water had to be earned. The crew on the weather decks could now see some of the objects with the naked eye. Dark metal shapes lifted out of the swell, close enough to feel personal. One sailor watched a contact slide down the port side, no farther away than a bad decision. Another stared at the sea itself, as if the water might change shape without warning. Nobody spoke more than necessary. The captain finally broke the silence. "No dramatic moves," he said. "We get through this by inches." The line settled over the bridge like ballast. It was not motivation, it was procedure, the simplest truth of the moment. Minutes passed, but on the ship they did not feel like minutes. They felt like individual helm orders stitched together by discipline. Ahead, the northern lane began to resolve. Narrow, imperfect, but possible. The Seahawk banked once more, its infrared sensors refining the path. Reference points were passed down to the ship. Relative bearings, clearer-looking water, known contacts on either side. Nothing guaranteed, just the best available route for a destroyer that refused to be rushed. Then, just as the bow began lining up with that thin thread of open water, one of the Iranian fast boats changed behavior. Its nose came around, its speed increased, and inside CIC, a new report cut through the room. Possible additional contacts in the water ahead. The lane out might be real, or it might be the final layer of the trap. At 5:23 local time, the destroyer committed to the narrow lane. Not fast, not cleanly, not with certainty. It committed because every other option was worse. On the bridge, the bow crept toward a strip of water that looked barely wide enough for error and far too narrow for comfort. To port, anchored contacts rose and vanished in the swell. To starboard, more dark shapes sat low and patient, their spacing too exact to dismiss. Between them was a corridor just wide enough to invite a mistake. The helmsman made the correction. Right 1 degree. A pause. Right 1 degree. The destroyer answered slowly, its mass shifting with controlled reluctance. Below, the engines held the ship at minimal headway. Too much thrust could widen the turn. Too little could let the current take the hull where no one wanted it to go. Overhead, the Seahawk tightened its orbit and pushed live video back into CIC. From above, the lane was visible, but only barely. A pale ribbon between dark points. A route defined less by safety than by absence. Then the Iranian craft moved. The fast boat that had been trailing off the starboard side suddenly increased speed. Its bow lifted. Spray kicked wide from both sides. It was not closing for a direct confrontation. It did not have to. It only needed to appear in the wrong place at the wrong second. Starboard contact accelerating, CIC reported. Closing angle shallow. Possible interference. That was enough to pull every eye in the room, because interference was all it needed to be. The destroyer could not turn away from a fast boat without thinking about what waited in the water beneath the next course change. The boat knew that. That was why it had moved. Then the radio came alive again, sharper than before. U.S. warship, alter immediately, alter immediately. There was no calm procedure left in the voice now. No disguise of a routine safety warning. Only pressure. This was command pressure. Time to land at the most dangerous phase of the transit. On the bridge, the captain did not answer the radio. He answered the boat. Train the 5-inch. The forward gun mount shifted only a few degrees. Not enough to suggest reckless action, just enough to be understood. A message written in steel, angle, and silence. The remote weapon stations came online. Watch teams locked in, no one engaged, no one lost discipline. Above the water, the Seahawk dropped lower. It came in fast over the Iranian craft, low enough for rotor wash to flatten the sea around it, low enough for every person on that deck to feel the weight of American presence from overhead. The helicopter did not strike. It did something more useful. It removed ambiguity. Its camera pods stared straight down. Its markings were visible. Its orbit was deliberate. It was sending the same message to the fast boat, the coast, and anyone else watching. You are now part of the record. For a moment, the boat kept coming. Then the bridge received the report no one wanted. Mine-like contact shifting starboard, bearing 091. Close. A dark object near the starboard edge of the lane rolled hard with the wake and current, drifting just enough to matter. On the bridge wing, one lookout could now see it without optics. Black metal, wet surface, low profile, too close to the hull for comfort. If the destroyer corrected too far away from it, it risked the contacts to port. If it held steady and the object kept drifting in, there might not be room for another adjustment. This was the moment the whole setup had been built for. Pressure from the boat, pressure from the radio, pressure from the water itself. Hold the lane, the captain said. No extra words, no emotion in the voice, just the order. The helmsman did exactly that. Hands steady, breathing shallow, a fraction left. Hold, wait, check the drift. The conning officer watched the bow as if focus alone could pull the ship clear. In CIC, no one looked away from the screens. The object rose on a swell. For 1 second, it looked close enough to touch. Then the hull slid past. No blast, no shock through the deck, no sudden wall of water, only the long grinding silence of a ship passing through a place where one wrong movement could have changed everything. The fast boat saw it too. Its speed dropped first. Then its bow angle changed. Not by much, just enough to show hesitation. The second Iranian boat, farther back, never fully committed. Offshore, the destroyer's electronic warfare team noticed another shift. Shore-based emissions began to thin. Search radar sweeps came less often. The pressure was still present, but its timing was slipping. That was the first sign the setup was failing. The destroyer kept moving, still inside the lane, still advancing as if every foot of water had to be negotiated with math, patience, and nerve. Another contact passed down the port side. Then another. Farther ahead, the water began to open by degrees. Not safe, not yet, but wider, cleaner. The captain finally keyed the radio. Unsafe interference with a United States warship is being recorded. The transmission was short, level, and cold. No dramatic warning, no raised voice. Just a line drawn in plain language. This time, no answer came back. At 5:31, the destroyer was nearly through the worst of it. Nearly. Ahead, beyond the final visible cluster of anchored contacts, open water began to appear in the dawn light. Behind and off the beam, the Iranian fast boats were slowing. Their movements no longer shaped the ship's decisions. They were only watching now. But no one aboard the destroyer confused almost with finished. After nearly an hour of precision under pressure, one truth still mattered. The ship was almost clear, and almost is one of the most dangerous words at sea. At 5:34 local time, the destroyer's bow finally cleared the last line of dark shapes. No one on the bridge celebrated. Not yet. Ahead, the water opened into a wider sheet of gray-blue dawn, smoother, cleaner. No longer broken by the deliberate rhythm of anchored objects rising with the swell. Astern, the mine-like belt began to fall away into the distance, still visible in broken patches through the morning haze. Still dangerous. Still exactly where someone had wanted it to be. But the destroyer was no longer inside it. "Steady on course," the captain said. The order came out flat, controlled, almost quiet. That was the sound of a ship surviving professionally. Engine output came up by a fraction, not a burst. Not a dramatic surge. Just enough to put more water between the steel hull and the dangerous pattern it had just passed through. On the bridge, officers kept scanning ahead, then checking the tactical repeater. In CIC, no one allowed relief to take over. Relief was how a crew missed the next problem. The rule was simple now. Clear did not mean safe. Above them, the Seahawk held position and turned back over the field. What had been a survival problem minutes earlier was now an intelligence target. The helicopter's infrared sensors swept the line from end to end. Every dark object was marked, time-stamped, and mapped. The southern lane, the one that had looked so inviting from a distance, was filmed again from multiple angles. The wake signature inside it was still visible. But now, without the pressure of immediate transit, the deception was easier to read. It did not look accidental anymore. It looked arranged, and that mattered. Because once a trap is understood, it becomes more than a threat. It becomes evidence. Inside CIC, the tactical picture grew cleaner by the minute. Mine-like contacts were numbered. Bearings were fixed. Drift was calculated. The semi-submerged object beyond the southern opening was logged with exact position and estimated depth. Shore-based radar activity that had appeared during the transit was matched against the timing of the Iranian radio calls and the movement of the fast boats. Nothing had been random. Not the warnings, not the pressure, not the timing. Now the ship could see the full shape of it. Iran had not simply placed hazards in open water, it had used a belt of mine-like objects to shape decision-making. It had used small boats to apply visual pressure. It had used radio calls to create urgency at the exact moment the destroyer needed patience. And somewhere in that chain, someone had assumed a U.S. warship under pressure would do what many vessels do under pressure. Turn too quickly. Guess? Lose discipline? That never happened. One of the lookouts on the bridge watched the field slide farther astern and said nothing. He did not need to. Everyone up there understood how thin the margins had been. A few degrees in the wrong direction, a little too much throttle, a reaction to the fast boat instead of the water. Any of those choices could have turned the morning into a disaster in the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, the destroyer was still underway, intact, controlled, and now more dangerous than before. Because survival was only the first result. The second was what the ship carried away. The helicopter transmitted another set of images. One contact showed a clear tether angle. Another revealed metal corrosion patterns that did not match long-term drift. A third sat almost perfectly positioned to influence a northbound transit. The field was no longer just a hazard on a screen. It was a layout, a method, a signature. The fast boats remained in the distance, but their role had changed too. Earlier, they had been part of the pressure system. Now they were simply tracks in the record, captured and boxed inside the destroyer's logs. Their acceleration points had been recorded, their position changes had been recorded, their relative headings had been recorded, so had the shore emissions, so had the radio calls, so had the exact minute the pressure began to fall apart. That may have been the real cost for Iran. Not only that the destroyer got through, but that the setup failed without forcing the reaction it was designed to trigger. And by failing, it revealed itself. The captain studied the forward horizon for another moment, then turned slightly towards CIC. "Continue collection," he said. "I want the whole pattern." That line explained what had really happened. This was never going to end with cheering on the bridge or some dramatic response into the dawn. That is not how a professional navy proves control. Control is leaving the danger area with the ship intact. Control is preserving the crew. Control is carrying away a complete picture of how the other side tried to shape the moment. By 5:42, the destroyer was making steady water again. The field was behind it. The Iranian boats were no longer influencing the ship's course. Shore radar activity had faded back into the background. On the surface, the sea looked ordinary again. But it was not ordinary anymore. A few miles astern sat the remains of a failed setup. And inside the destroyer's systems was something even more valuable. A map of the trap. A timeline of the pressure. A record of exactly how to defeat it next time. Iran had tried to turn the sea itself into the weapon. The destroyer turned the trap into a map.